Hey, can y'all hear me? Awesome. I have no idea why my screen is yellow.
We're actually going to have you mute because we're about to start.
Okay, Dr. Gigi, go ahead and start.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Gigi El-Bayoumi, and I'm the founding director of the Rodham Institute. Welcome to our Rodham Institute Impact Speaker Series. You know, there's been a lot that's been going on in the last several months. We've had the pandemic with a record number of deaths here in the United States, about 600 in Washington, D.C. And then we've had really a series of murders, and really the past history of racism and the ongoing legacy of racism has come to the fore. I think that the fact that we were all in lockdown in a pandemic, we were all kind of, I don't know, a captive audience of sorts. It was much more difficult to run away from the realities or to say that one was too busy to hear about all these different people that have been murdered in cold blood. So, you know, the Rodham Institute, we are dedicated to improving health equity in Washington, D.C. So you might say, well, what does having anything to do, racism having anything to do with health equity? Well, actually, it has a lot to do with health equity. And actually, if you look simply at the recent COVID crisis and look at the numbers of Black and Brown people that are dying, it's double and sometimes triple what it is compared to the sort of the white community. In Washington, D.C., upwards of 80% of all the deaths have occurred in African Americans. So for us, we know that the main factors that play into life expectancy are actually the social determinants of health. And I'd like to think that, you know, as a doctor, I contribute to people's health, but really the reality is that 80% of the life expectancy is attributable to where you're born, how much of an income that you have, what your education is, what is the quality of the food that you eat, the air that you breathe, and the water that you drink. What is the economic health of the environment that you live in, and your education. So in a country where really we don't deviate a lot in terms of if I'm born into a particular class, it's likely that my children will be born into that class and grandchildren and so forth. There's a very tight correlation in the United States with sort of an upper limit on sort of what you can achieve based on the circumstances that you were born in. And there's nothing in the history of the world that compares to the African American experience. 400 years of slavery, but just as important, violence that's been waged against Black people in this country, humiliation, and of course, lack of opportunity, and lack of opportunity even when people are trying to get into schools to try to, you know, eat healthy and all of this. And unfortunately, you know, we have a lot of blaming the victim, especially in the health care field. Oh, if somebody doesn't do anything, they're non-compliant, or they don't want to follow a diet that's healthy, or they just don't know, or they're refusing to do things. Well, just like any other institution, health centers, we are a reflection of the larger society, and we have a lot of racism. One of the real reasons that I established the Rodham Institute is I was dismayed that people who went to become doctors, medical students, will go in with all the right reasons, and then by the time they're finished with their training, they really may be somewhat unrecognizable to themselves, because what we teach is actually that institutionalized racism. We teach that the very backs of the people, mostly Black and brown and poor, that the residents get their training on are the ones that get objectified. So, you know, our philosophy is that, and you'll see this on the screen, that health equity is actually social justice, is legal justice, is economic justice. So this is, you know, one issue, and racism or equity, put it in a positive way, equity means equity in all of those things, and that they feed into each other. One struggle, many fronts. I'd like to show the priority areas of the Rodham Institute. Community collaboration obviously is very important, and we've done a lot of things since COVID to, you know, feed people in Southeast, 1,100 meals delivered, 1,200 masks delivered, and then these webinars as well with our partner institutions such as Temple Praise in Ward 8 and Pennsylvania Avenue Baptist Church in Ward 7. We've got youth workforce training and development, and then we think it's also very important to train the people in the healthcare system around the social determinants of health and health equity. So please visit our website. I think it's robust. For any of you that have missed any of our webinars, you can actually watch them. This is, I think, a great resource, our COVID resources, and we really try to present and highlight a lot of the work that's being done all over the city, and I think some wonderful resources. So I hope you can visit that website. And then I'd like to thank the staff who really have done so much, especially during this pandemic. And really there are two pandemics, the pandemic of the COVID virus and the pandemic of the racism virus. So I want to start off by thanking Ms. Ashanti Carter, who is the program manager and now a PhD student and candidate here at GW in the graduate students educational section or department. And she is the program manager that is actually set up and came up with the idea of this particular series that we are going to be doing today, this subject. I'd like to thank Ms. Christina Williams, who has been the one that has really been the power behind and the really the work behind getting the food and the masks delivered. And then Ms. Tracy Bass, who is the director of the Help and Workforce Pipeline Program. And we're going to be starting the summer online program for middle and high school kids very, very soon. So these are some ways for you to get involved in the Rodham Institute. And, you know, we've got the webinars. We want you to share on social media, our resources. It doesn't have to be a big involvement. We know that just small involvements in terms of all of us and many numbers make a big difference. Okay, well, with that, I would like to share, and there's our social media screen. And I wanted to give a special thanks and a shout out to Ms. Zaina Houri, who is our Rodham Institute intern and going to be studying medicine and starting medical school in just a few short months. She's been amazing with our website and our social media and these PowerPoint presentations. So thank you, Zaina. All right, I would like to, first of all, thank our panelists. You know, rated R, Unpacking Whiteness in the Face of Racism is a tough subject. And actually, this subject, this panel was one that was put together before the recent murders. And I think that, you know, the panelists that are going to join us and will be speaking reflect, first of all, their commitment to racial equity. They're bringing their voices to speak truth to power. And really, as we look at sort of the truth and reconciliation part of our very dark history, our collective dark history, we have to band together and we have to hear voices and we have to have allies in a number of different spheres. So I'd like to start off by introducing Ms. Julia Collette. She is a colleague of Ms. Ashanti Carter. She's a doctoral student at the Graduate School of Education and Human Development here at GWU. And she's going to be introducing our guests, and I want to just thank them in advance. And I want to just finally say that this is the beginning of the conversation. This is by no means one and done. This is the beginning of the discussion so that we can see how we can do better, how we can do better as individuals, how we can serve, whether it's our students, our learners, our patients, our community members, and each other best. So thank you for your attention, and take it away, PhD candidate, Julia Collette.
Thank you, Dr. Gigi. Hi, everyone. So like Dr. Gigi said, my name is Julia Collette. I am going to be introducing our panelists. So I'm going to start with Dr. Karen Rice. She obtained her MSW from Temple University in 2000 and her PhD in social work in 2011 from the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Currently, she serves as the chair of the social work department at Millersville University, where she has been employed since 2006. She teaches research, statistics, global social work, and diversity to students across all three levels, BSW, MSW, and DSW, in terms of social work education. Currently, she's utilizing a social justice and human rights framework. Her research centers on ways to enhance individuals' level of compassion, advocacy, and dialogue across and within various social groups. So thanks for being with us here tonight, Dr. Rice. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Ashley Stone. She is an assistant professor of higher education administration at the George Washington University. Her research focuses on rural students in higher education, and she works to disrupt monolithic notions of what it means to be rural by highlighting the racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity that is often overlooked in rural communities. She began her career in multicultural affairs while earning her master's degree at Baylor University, and worked in service learning and community engagement initiatives while pursuing her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. So thanks for being with us tonight, Dr. Stone. And lastly, we have Mr. Brian Daniel. He is a higher educational professional with over 9 years of experience in the field of higher education and has worked in residence life, first-year experience, and student success, and has helped with various diversity and inclusion initiatives on campus. Brian is currently a doctoral student in the Higher Education Administration program at the University of West Georgia, and he plans to conduct his research on the impact of hate crimes on residential college campuses. So thank you for being with us tonight, Brian. It's Mr. Daniel. As your friend, that sounds like a weird thing to say. My name is Julia Collette. I also have years of experience in residence life, and I am currently working on my doctorate in higher education administration. I got my master's degree from Iowa State in 2015, and I am currently job searching, which is hard in a pandemic. So to get us started, we're gonna go through some definitions. And so the goal of these definitions is to help everyone who is participating in this webinar tonight to really have equal footing so that we can all understand what these words mean, so while panelists are answering questions. And I want to say that some of these concepts are much larger than a PowerPoint slide. And so if you would like to understand a concept better, Google it. But we'll get started with our first one, race. So race is the grouping of human beings based on shared physical or social qualities into categories that are generally viewed as distinct by society. So white, Black, etc. Racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. racism is based on the concept of whiteness. It's this idea that racism couldn't exist without whiteness. And so it's a constantly shifting barrier because whiteness has allowed several other groups of people who weren't historically considered white to be in the group of whiteness. White privilege is the implicit or systemic advantages that white people have relative to people who are the objects of racism. So it's the absence of suspicion and other negative reactions that people who are objects of racism experience. So an example, as you can see in the picture, is like that there are more hurdles that Black people and people of color have to overcome compared to white people in order to get to the same end goal. Whiteness is complex. It is a system that allows white people to have privileges and advantages. They're usually cultural lessons that white people learn. And so it's an ideology that's based on beliefs, values, behaviors, habits, attitudes, and it ultimately results in the unequal distribution of power and privilege based on skin color. Equity is about giving people the resources that they need in order to be successful. Equity should not be confused with sameness. So giving everyone the same thing is equality, but giving people what they need to be successful is equity. And last, anti-racism. So anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, attitudes, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. And so understanding one's whiteness and dismantling whiteness is an act of anti-racism. Great. Thank you. So I'm going to get us started with our first question. What do you see as the difference between white and whiteness? And when did you become aware of those things? And I will have Dr. Stone start.
I was going to say, since I brought this up earlier, I would go ahead and start by talking about this. And in the beginning, the conversation that we were having was the difference between knowing that I was white, growing up, and in some ways understanding and seeing really overt and specific racism happening in the world around me, and knowing that I was not the target of those things, versus as I grew up and finally began to understand what whiteness did for me. And I think that the difference in that, like, there's one thing to understand that in the world I am a white person, and then to finally understand whiteness as that system, that complex ideology that is both socially and politically constructed, and that the ways in which I benefit from that. And coming from a rural community that was predominantly white, and seeing people who are white suffering economically, understanding that there's a difference in that and what we talk about privilege moving through the world, and understanding the ways in which I benefited, not just that wasn't just an economic benefit that I would see because I was a white person, but the ways in which I saw white people represented in the curriculum that I grew up with, in the teachers that I saw growing up, but also the faculty members that I encountered in my undergraduate and most of my graduate courses, understanding that those were two separate things and beginning to grapple with what that meant. So for me, those were sort of the differences in just physically appearing as white in the world and then understanding what that meant more deeply.
Hi, everybody. So I grew up in the suburbs of Virginia Beach, and a fairly white area. I attended a private school growing up at a local Quaker school, and learned about the principles of celebrating diversity and the power of inclusion. But while looking around the classroom and looking at my teachers, I found everyone who looked like me. And so while I was really fortunate to be taught the principles of valuing everybody and treating everybody with inherent worth and dignity, um, there weren't people who identified differently, racially differently than me. And so it honestly, it wasn't until college. I attended Guilford College in North Carolina, and I was an elementary education major, and it was there where I learned a lot of really important lessons about the disparities and the benefits that I had growing up in my white suburban, neighborhood in southeastern Virginia, than other peers in my class, but also learning about the inequities of Black people and other people of color and what they experienced in their educational upbringings as well, and learned how that impacted the benefits that I had growing up.
So for me, it's an interesting situation. I navigated two worlds most of my elementary, middle school years. And I say that because I grew up in the city of, and I say city, knowing that it's a small city of Lancaster County where I reside, but it's a very, so I grew up in a very diverse neighborhood. But because of districting and the way in which districting occurs, I lived on the side of the street where the three houses on that side went to a school district in the suburbs, and it was the richest school district in our county. So I had, school friends who looked like me, who were white, and then I go home, and what I refer to as my real friends, right? Most of them do not look like me, and so it's this world that I had to navigate. So I learned early on the differences in one's color of their skin and the way in which people are perceived because of navigating these two worlds early on. So that's how I became aware of being white and what white means and what not white is. And I think it took some time, however, to really recognize then my privilege as a white person, because I grew up in poverty. I was a first generation high school graduate. So for me, it's, we talk about, when you first, what does white mean and being white and white privilege, and immediately sometimes you become defensive of like, no, I had hardship. And I think recognizing the fact that just because you had hardship doesn't mean you don't have privilege. And it goes back to what Julia was saying earlier about this system, this whiteness, and what is whiteness, right? And so I learned early on, I didn't learn until later in life. Like I learned early on about my whiteness, but I didn't learn until later in life what it means to have white privilege. And I recognized the advantages that that was afforded to me because of that being white. And, as I said, I was a first generation high school graduate, but, I was able to get supports through school to get me into college that my friends in my neighborhood were not afforded those same resources and benefits.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rice. I think that that's something that a lot of people, white people especially, can relate to, is that duality of experience. And so my next question for you all is, what does it mean to you specifically to unpack whiteness? I know that that's the title of our webinar, but I think that that can be some fairly academic language. And so, like, what does that mean for you in your work? And how do you, and in your life, and how do you go about breaking that down in a way that maybe other people can understand it.
I know I ended. I can start, just get us started. So when I think about unpacking whiteness, I really think about unlearning what I call the whitewashing of the history of the United States, right? That's really what it is. It's recognizing and it's understanding how our whiteness, right, and how white privilege, how it shows up in individual behaviors. How does it show up in the culture within our workplaces? How does it show up within our communities? And really recognizing, right, that the history that we were taught, that narrative of the United States, that it's not just incomplete, it's inaccurate. And so when we unpack that, we have to take the time then to recognize first how, right? How did I come to recognize and to believe the beliefs that I have, right? And believe the events occurred the way I was told they occurred. And then if that's not the truth, then what is the truth, right? So it's understanding that socialization process that we that's imposed upon us, right? We don't have to do anything. This just happens. And so it's those interpersonal relationships that you have early on, and then the connections you have at the institutions, and then this bombardment by social media that reinforces this notion of whiteness and superiority of a particular race. And so to unpack that, I have to relearn. And so it's a action on my part, deliberate action on my part, then to relearn that history.
I think about it in very similar ways, but also thinking about it as the actual metaphor of unpacking and what happens. And so I think about it when I've moved to a new place, which I've gotten to do more than I wanted to over the last 3 or 4 years. Each time I move to a new place, when I open and unpack a box, I have to find a place for everything that was inside of that. And I think that over time, that's a good lesson for me as I think about what happened as I was beginning to understand whiteness and racism at not just an individual and overt level, but the ways in which it happened systemically. As I began to understand that through understanding sort of the not only, again, erasure, but inaccuracies that were in the history I was taught in the ways that our social systems are set up, that also meant that I had to confront the ways in which I didn't just have to think, oh, you have not made this racist joke before, or you have not inflicted this direct harm on someone, but the ways in which I was complicit in these systems, the ways in which I advanced them, the ways in which even things that were race neutral, if enacted in a system that has racism embedded within it, that I've been complicit in advancing that. And so I needed to face and take responsibility for thinking about those things. And it's one thing to say, oh, I have white privilege, and keep it neatly tucked away in a box and say, well, that's really unfortunate, I'm going to move on. I think for me, the unpacking is having to take all of those things out and find a place for them, find out what am I going to do about the fact that this exists, and think about what I have to take action on. And again, I think that that's where it moves from thinking, acknowledging it, to becoming anti-racist, is saying, if we acknowledge that these things are happening, we have to decide what we're going to do to counteract that, to create equity, or at the same time going in and saying, we need to disembed this from the system. What does it mean to get it out from the root and create something new? And so for me, I think that that's what sort of the idea of unpacking it is having to do the hard work of not just dealing with it and understanding that it exists, but thinking about my own role in its perpetuation.
I really like the metaphor of actually thinking about unpacking. I think that helps. That helps for me to think about that. So I appreciate that. I think for me, kind of similar, is first is to recognize and acknowledge that I am white, I think that's important, to make that acknowledgement. And so, kind of as the other folks on this panel have said, is to do my best to unlearn a lot of the histories that were presented to me in my textbooks growing up, and to critically reflect on and analyze my own experiences, and identify the power systems that were designed for me to benefit. And you know, that critical reflection, there's I have the privilege to engage in this. And I'm, you know, not going to say that I do this as much as I would like. I think that I have a lot of more work to do. But I think that it's really, really important to be critical of our surroundings. I understand that, yes, I am a white individual. I'm a white male, navigating this world. And there comes with that, is a lot of unearned privileges that I, as a white and male individual, experience. And so I think that's important to identify, and after you identify, reflect, and then after reflect, working towards justice, using the unearned privileges that I have to serve as an ally for other folks in other marginalized identities. But it's yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you all for that. I think that the biggest takeaway is that it's an active process, is that it's something we're constantly doing, right? And I think that a lot of times when white folks are confronted with these ideas, it can be really uncomfortable. It can bring up a lot of feelings of guilt. And so, which is natural based on the way that in the context of the United States, we were taught to think about race. And so what advice would you give to folks, like in terms of navigating that discomfort when unpacking their own whiteness? Dr. Rice, do you want to start?
Sure. So I teach a course, and I start off with you know, an exercise where students are uncomfortable, right? And then I proceed with saying, you know, this process, right, of becoming, it's a course that explores all issues of manifestations of oppression, right, all the isms. And so it's to be an advocate, right, you're going to be uncomfortable as you move along that journey, and recognizing that it's a process and that you're going to make mistakes, and that this work is not comfortable. And so I immediately make them uncomfortable, because I want them to know that this is not comfortable. That for most of my students, right, their life has been comfortable. And so now they need to experience what it means to be uncomfortable. And if you want to be an ally, it takes more than just saying. So I appreciate what you said, Ashley, how it's not just recognizing the privilege that you now have to do something about that, right? And so it's a balance, right? Like you want to foster that journey that individuals take. And so you need to assist them through that process and supporting them through that process. And so giving them permission to make mistakes, I think, is really important. Otherwise, individuals become so concerned that they're going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing that then they won't say or do anything. And so we need to give permission to make mistakes, but at the same time, we have to hold them accountable. And so it's explaining what they did that was wrong, and why it was harmful, and why it was incorrect. And so providing them with the tools that they need, either, you know, as a white person, I can teach them, but as a person of color, I don't expect you to teach me as a white person. So then I'm going to go and get the resources that I need to educate myself and to become more informed, so that I don't make that mistake again, right? And so then it's that balance of supporting through the process, but then also challenging them along the way. And the other piece of advice that I want to give is sometimes, so that's the one side. People, you know, they don't want to do anything, and so they just stay in that comfort zone, right? That we can sit in as a white person. And So we're trying to challenge them to get them out. But then you have some that are like, okay, I'm an ally. I'm not a racist, and I'm going to jump right into this cause, and I'm going to bring about change, right? And so to those individuals, I want to pull them back, and I want to say, like, let's pause, right? Like, let's think about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and are you ready to do this, right? So we appreciate the support and the advocacy and the desire to be dismantle these racist institutions and policies and programs and practices. But do you have the tools to do it, and are you doing it for the right reasons? And so regardless of who we're talking about, the work has to start. And I think, Brian, you mentioned this, it has to start with oneself. And so navigating, I think you can navigate all of this discomfort if you first take the time to reflect and do your own work, right? So dismantling whiteness, you got to dismantle the whiteness, and it is a process, and it starts with you.
Yeah, Dr. Rice, I really like what you had to say. You're right. It does start with us, and it's important to acknowledge that we're going to make mistakes, and to be ready to receive that criticism can be scary, right? And so I think that it's important for to acknowledge that we are going to make mistakes, and try our best to use those opportunities as an opportunity for learning and growth. And then, not just say, oh, I'm sorry, and then don't use that opportunity to work on yourself. Really use it. I mean, I think that when people correct us, that's a sign of love. And I think that, that's an opportunity of connection that somebody made with us. And I think that whoever, even though none of us like to be corrected, right? We want to be right all the time. But when someone says, no, you're wrong, and here's why, that can be tough to hear. But I think that it's really important for us to use that to reflect, and then have those lessons inform our future behaviors. And so to take that and to really live that out. And then I'd also add to, in terms of, how do we navigate discomfort? I think that, sometimes when we say, well, I don't want to be racist, I don't want to, am I racist? Was it what I did something? How can I support? I think that when I speak a lot with other white colleagues and individuals, and we talk about these things. But I think that it's important to also not go to a person of color, directly to a person of color on your staff or on your team, and have them try to help you without you doing your research first. I think that's really important, in that the onus is on us as white individuals to learn and to come prepared, so that if you are to draw from the expertise of a Black person or other person of color in your office, on your team, wherever, that you've done your homework, and that the questions that you might want to ask other folks aren't basic questions. Maybe they're more questions seeking some form of clarity.
I wonder if I could just jump in for a minute, because I'm very moved by the discussion, first of all, and the openness, and really the transparency and the willingness to talk about these difficult subjects. It struck me, Dr. Rice, that in speaking, I really appreciated your thing about sort of pulling the reins, especially now. I mean, you're seeing a lot of exuberance, and that's great. But I look at this more as being part of a marathon, not a sprint. And that what we don't want to happen is for people to get discouraged, right? That this is something for the long haul, and that small steps, as long as they're in the forward direction, make a difference. And so, I often share what I see as racism and classism on almost a daily basis in my workspace. And that is, we've got medical assistants that are part of the team. And, there's a very hierarchical way that we in the medical system work, right? Physician is God and everybody else below, which is ridiculous, because It's ridiculous, right? That's a different kind of dismantling that needs to be done, but it's part of a sort of a greater issue. So medical assistants tend to be Black women. They, have a high school degree, but their education, they don't have a whole bunch of letters after their names. And I will tell you that people, including colleagues and learners, come into the morning into the clinic, maybe have been working there for years and don't even acknowledge the presence of that individual. Now, from my culture, I'm of Egyptian heritage, shunning is about the worst thing that you can do to somebody, not acknowledging their presence. And, I always say that in South Africa, the way that people greet is to say, I see you. And how something, I mean, and if you ask these people, and I know some of my colleagues, they're quote liberal, they're this and that, but in the day to day, I mean, I am shocked by some of the behaviors that I watch. And then on a systemic or an institutional level, and this really bothers me a lot, that if I, God forbid, a million times had a death in the family, I would take however much time. For them, it's only 2 days. And it can only be, a sister, brother, mother, father, child. So we have situations where people are putting patients in the rooms and they are crying because they're grieving. And yes, as I say, class is an aspect of this, but fundamentally, race. I mean, it's sort of both. So I so appreciate your talking about starting with ourselves as human beings, but also looking at the very small microcosm that we exist in.
I really appreciate what everyone's had to say and would echo that in the dealing with the discomfort. And I think that one of the things that's been the biggest piece for me and in talking with my students is that you are just going to need to live in this discomfort. It will change over time, but that there's not an end point to this. This is the magic carpet box of things to unpack. It will be a constant process. And for me, accepting that I am going to mess up and I am going to need correction, just knowing that that will be the reality has been helpful in saying, okay, so let's keep moving forward. And that doesn't mean when I mess up, I'm no longer able to try to do anti-racist work. It just means I'm learning and I'll need to continue to adapt how I'm doing that. And I need to be teachable. I think for me, I also have to constantly come back to, no matter how uncomfortable this is, to sit with thinking about my complicity and trying to work against the complicity I've had in these systems of oppression, that does not compare to experiencing that oppression directly. And it is a part of the privilege that I have would be to say, okay, I'm going to go back and sit in my comfort for a while and not continue to do this work. My Black friends, colleagues, students don't have that opportunity. They don't have that privilege. And so I must continue in this minimal discomfort that I'm having to process in order to continue this work, that is important for me to continue to manage. And so I think that's saying lean into this. I think the other piece of it that's kind of been mentioned before that I try to remember and try to work with my students on is that then we're not asking, again, our Black colleagues, students, friends, or other students of color to help us process that, to add additional burden, again, in the learning, but also in helping us manage our own feelings of discomfort through this, that we take responsibility for that ourselves. There are people of color who have been writing about this for a long time, who have spoken about this. We have lots of different resources that we can find, that we can use, that are still coming, their voices from these populations that we could use as resources without asking that additional burden of our colleagues to do that as well. And so I think, again, understanding the difference between those two things and understanding the importance of just continuing, and that it's not like, oh, I'll work through this for a few days or for this semester, and then I'm going to feel great about it and I'm not going to mess up anymore and I'm going to continue to feel really good about the work that I've done. No, there will be new work to be done, but being committed to the importance of that process.
Yeah, certainly. I think that it's helpful for folks to know that this is like a thing that you'll deal with for the rest of your life if you're doing it right. Is that we are constantly growing, we're constantly learning and understanding, oh, what I just did was racist. How do I make sure I don't do that again? And so we don't necessarily know until someone that loves us brings it to our attention, or that we reflect on that and say, oh gosh, that was terrible. And so, I think that one of the most helpful things for me in this process of unpacking my own whiteness is talking to my family and friends and coworkers, etc., about whiteness and what it means to be white for us. And so, how would you go about talking to other people about whiteness, especially in our current climate? Brian, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Um, Julia, I think you hit the nail on the head in talking about this with our family and friends, right? Using Thanksgiving dinners as an opportunity, and other gatherings, right, um, where you have a special time together with each other for connection, to highlight these injustices, and to utilize these opportunities, especially if we don't see each other often, to with your family or friends, to prioritize this, to prioritize this work, to make this a priority, and to engage in this work, in these dialogues. It's a lot easier to talk about things that we're comfortable with, right? And that's, I think, as humans, that's what we lean towards. We lean towards things that we know. And there's a lot about white privilege that I don't know. And I will go throughout my entire life not even knowing, hardly any of the privileges that I have benefited from during my lifetime. And that's scary, and that's upsetting, and that's not something that, if I were to have a list of conversation topics, that would be necessarily in my top three. But it's important, right? It's important that we have these conversations, that we talk with our loved ones, that we utilize that time together appropriately. That, if somebody in your family or one of your friends says something that's problematic, to, again, love on them, use that experience to share, not only that it was wrong, but why. And then, follow up with conversations, and about reflection. I think that, it's not just about something that we said, and then someone says that's, you're correcting a family or friend, and say, well, that was hurtful. I think that what's more important is the why, is to allow an opportunity to educate, and allow them some room. I think, Dr. Rice, you talked about the challenge and support model, and I think that comes into play here. You want to provide that challenge, but then also support them on their journey, and in hopes that, they'll then support you on yours as well.
I just actually posted something on the chat. I found this great sort of handout called 16 Bridge Building Tips for White People. It's Be the Bridge, Moving Towards Racial Reconciliation. Because I think it is tough, and certainly when one is afraid that they're going to make a mistake, I mean, that's walking on eggshells. But I wanted to share an experience that I had when I'm from Michigan. When I moved from Michigan to DC at the very beginning of the AIDS epidemic, I really did not have any kind of interaction with the LGBTQ community. And working at the height of the AIDS epidemic, I had to learn very quickly, because gay men predominantly at that time was who I was serving. And the approach that I used was, look, please teach me. I want to learn. And, I think it was different in that I'm not putting the burden on them, but I had to learn so I could give better service. So what is it how do you want me to serve you? And in some ways, it's easier, I guess, if you have a service relationship that can give you permission to say, look, I want to do better for you. It's a little bit different than, explain to me everything about gay people and what's the history of gay people and oppression. But I think, that's an example of putting yourself in an open way to say, I want to learn, and please give me the opportunity to do well by you.
I find that I sometimes have to put ground rules in place, to be quite honest. So it's kind of the same model that I used in my teaching of students with how they can have these conversations with their friends and with their loved ones, that I also apply in my own life, right? And so being open to have these discussions, because part of being an ally is helping others move along their journey as well. So I have to be willing to engage in these conversations, and I have to be willing to listen. And so sometimes that requires kind of guidelines or ground rules or whatever you want to call it be put in place, that I'm willing to have this conversation if it's done respectfully, right? And if you're listening, to learn. I think that's the really important piece. And don't just prepare your argument and not really listen to what someone has to say. And then of course facts, like I can have a discussion with you, but it's got to be grounded in facts. And I'm not here to look at the latest meme that you're going to show me, or the whatever was on Facebook that did you see this and this happens to be true. Like it has to be authentic, and you need to be willing to learn. One of the other things that I think is really important that you can do, again, is watch documentaries together as a family and say, let's have a conversation about it afterwards. But not just the conversation about the content of the documentary, but how did that challenge my thinking, and how is that different than what I was taught, right? So that's how we move along this journey, is if we have a conversation about, did this align with what I thought? And if it didn't, why? Like, why is this so different from what I thought was, true, right? It goes back to that unpacking whiteness, right? And how we have to learn the truth about the history of the United States, because the narrative that we were told is, as I said, often inaccurate. And so documentaries, I think, are great for that. Reading books together as a family and processing them together, I think are great ways to have conversations. I also am very big about talking to family about what they post on social media, since social media is a big thing, and having conversations about what is your goal for posting that, right? Are you posting that because you want an attaboy, right? Because you want people to say you're a good person? Or are you doing it to raise awareness, to educate others, right? And whose voice then is being centered when you are posting stuff? Is it, again, about is it more about yourself, or is it about the cause? And are you going beyond? I think we talked about this before. Social media is great to raise awareness and to educate and to inform people if it's done correctly, but that can't just be the only thing you do. So then providing suggestions on what actions they can take, right? Political actions, get out and vote, sign petitions, donate your time, give resources if you can. So there's lots of ways that you can engage family and help and friends and help them along their journey as well.
I think similarly for me, it's also been about thinking about, I don't talk to all of my family members in the same way, in the same sense that I can understand that I have a long way to go, and I'm going to need the resources and people who are helping me along my journey to meet me where I'm at and help me get to the next place, that for different people in my family or different friends in different parts of my life, they're all in different places. And so the resources that we're using or the conversations that we can have are in different places. And so I think being open to understanding that where I've been at different parts of my journey and trying to say, I understand and I've been there, and I'll meet you here and walk with you through this piece as well. And talking to, I think asking questions, like similarly to what you said, like asking questions about statements that are made, jokes that are made, posts that are made, and trying to get at the root of what they're wanting to accomplish, or correcting with just fact, just saying, here are the facts, here's the information, or asking for the sources from what they're sharing. I think all of these things can help be a way to have people pause and really think about what is at the root of what's happening, at the root of what they're sharing. What are the reasons behind what they want to accomplish? And so I think just meeting people where they are. And I think that too, when you want to bring that up, you also have to be ready for that to create tension in your relationships. I think we talk a lot about our own discomfort in facing our whiteness and processing our whiteness in just our own journey and understanding our complicitness in racism, but we also have to understand and be willing to accept the tension that these conversations can create in our relationships when we want to hold others that we're in relationship with accountable, but understand that those boundaries for us are important, and that's going to be a necessary part of this process as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Stone. We are getting close to the end of our time, so I'm going to ask one last question. This is from a panelist. I think this is a good place to maybe end on for our hour. What resources are available for someone who wants to learn more about anti-racist work? Where might you go? What might you look at? Let's see, Dr. Stone, do you want to start us?
So Google is one place to start. It's a powerful tool. So Google can be a great tool, especially right now. Again, you can see there are a number of different, actually even Google Forms where people are collecting lists of anti-racist resources, and their lists that are going around that talk about everything. How do you talk to children about racism? So they have different age levels that you can go through. They have different mediums, whether it be books, journal articles, documentaries, podcasts, that there are lots of different collections now that are coming up of that. I think the important thing, and a note that one of my former faculty members was posting the other day too, is though also to look at what are the sources of those resources, and that there are some great, I appreciate this panel. While there are some white allies who are working hard to do anti-racist work, a lot of times they are a mouthpiece that's work that Black people, other people of color have already been doing. And so go to those sources. And I think that that's an important thing that I try to think about a lot is, yes, in moments when it may be safer for me to help amplify the voices of people of color or Black people in particular, that I work to do that. But the point is to go back, that it's their voices, their message that needs to be heard. And so again, we don't have to ask these people to keep reinventing the wheel. Those resources are already tangible and exist. And so going to those original sources and using the Google and everything else that's available to you to find them is a really powerful way. And I don't know if we can find some of those. I would be happy to find some of those lists and share them to the site as well. Again, I like that there's the diversity that exists in those lists, so you can sort of determine where you want to get started at.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. especially right now. There's so many resources that are being shared through social media, and that's great. And I think that it's while we're receiving all of this information so accessibly right now, I think that we ought to consider to critically analyze where the sources are coming from, right? And so I think that that's important work on our end. Is, just as with any news that's shared out there, that it's our responsibility to make sure that we are making sure that the resources that we're going to invest our time and energy into are those that are accurate, and that are that do uplift the individuals and Black people and other people of color. So I think that's important for that as well.
The only thing I would just add is look at what's going on within your local communities. There's already probably lots of organizations, probably local chapters of, Black Lives Matter, local chapters of the NAACP. You also probably have other local organizations that are doing movements nationally. Some of the organizations I can think of is the Equal Justice Institute, the Poor People's Campaign. Politically, get on change.org, Amnesty International, Move On, and look for like current petitions that are there to sign on to support. Look at pending bills and contact your legislators. I'm big in political advocacy. That's for long-term sustainable change to disrupt these structures, right? Like we have to understand the structures and how it happens, and what are the policies that maintain it? What are the practices that are the norms that reinforce it? And then the values, right, that we have that explain why we are doing this. And so we have to get into these, recognize these systems that are already in place and organizations that already exist, and then work with them to begin to dismantle these structures that are perpetuating racism.
Absolutely. Right now, I think even Amazon has like several free documentaries and movies that you can watch that you once had to pay for, but given what's going on, they're all available for free. And so it is 7 o'clock. And so I just wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists, Dr. Ashley Stone, Dr. Karen Rice, and Mr. Brian Daniel. Thank you to the Rodham Institute and Dr. Gigi for allowing us to have some space to talk about this. This is really just the beginning, and we know that. And so I know that Ashanti and I will be working in the future to plan additional conversations so that people can continue to dive into these concepts and really work through them. And with that, Dr. Gigi, do you have anything else to say?
Yes, I want to say thank you to all of you. This was a very rich conversation. And as you mentioned, Julia, this is the beginning of the conversation. I just wanted to, make one sort of to piggyback on what's been said. We can learn a lot about what Black people have done for the city by learning about the history. So education, especially around history, I think is a means to that. I mean, the people who, were just some of the communities that are being gentrified, for example, in Berry Farm, those are the people that built Howard University. The people that are at the historically Black college, Howard University itself. Learning about the history of our city is a way for us to begin, at least in our own minds, to dismantle some of the narratives that have been advanced. So just thank you, thank you, thank you. Some great information. We'd be happy to post any of the references on our website, and let's keep this conversation going. Thanks again, everybody. Bye-bye.